Again, good morning, everybody. I guess I could sort of say, spoiler alert, more bad news. And advance warning, I have some very boring slides, which is very unusual for me. But I decided that because so many of you have English as a second, third, or fourth language, which makes me feel very envious. And I thought maybe by doing some boring text slides, simple text slides in English, it might be easier for you to follow what I'm going to say. Okay, political economy, the first thing. If we talk about political economy of trade, and that's the frame I want to use in getting around the vaccine issue, trade is certainly not something that's new. It's every kind of human society has traded in some way or another. But of course, what is new is the creation of all of these new global trade rules. And these were largely written and put in place by wealthier countries. And perhaps unsurprisingly, as these rules became crafted and ratified and with their enforcement measures, it's these wealthy countries that tended to benefit from them. Now, in very broad terms, trade rules, their aim is to increase the cross-border flow of goods, services, and capital. Unusually, of course, TRIPS managed to get into the WTO set of rules, and it is entirely protectionist. So the irony is we have a protectionist agreement sitting inside a suite of supposedly anti-protectionist liberalization agreements. Now, during the pandemic, when it hit, many trade rules were abandoned, they were amended, they were simply ignored. And in high-income countries, this was generally took the form of subsidies to companies, notably in vaccines, but in all other forms of medical products or technologies to assist in terms of dealing with the pandemic. In a lot of low and middle income countries, their response was really reduced to restricting or banning some of the exports of the goods that they needed to deal with the pandemic within their own borders. Now, it's been argued that these could have been exempt from WTO trade rules under some of the exemptions that the WTO system allows. Maybe so. But in fact, no country challenged another country. So countries kind of went back into their own little kind of their crab shells, as it were, and decided that we're just going to look after what's happening in here. We don't want to sort of go and challenge and piss off another country because maybe they'll do the same back to us. So there was a way in which nobody bothered to challenge one another. Now, the one exception to all of this is that TRIPS rules, until the very flawed TRIPS waiver, were not touched at all. So they just stayed exactly as they were. Now, since the pandemic, there's been a bit of a shift around trade going on, the geopolitical dynamics. We still have a lot of trade, but we now have this kind of shoring, this kind of home shoring or friend shoring. So these attempts to sort of try to control more of the supply chains, but there's still a lot of trade going on. Now, I want to mention one other kind of set of trade agreements, but they're really investment agreements, because they have an odd, very marginal but potential effect coming out of the pandemic. Now, the first of all, we know about, I assume many of us know about the international investment agreements and the international state dispute settlement process by which corporations can sue governments for changes that they make in their policies or regulations that could affect the value of their investment, including estimates, outrageously high estimates of future potential profit. Now, it's a ridiculous system. Most of these rules were written in the 90s, the neoliberal 90s. They give enormous interpretive power to corporate lawyers who sit in these secret tribunals and make these really strange, huge, outrageous awards. Most of them, and most of our concern, is about how this is affecting the extractives industry and what the potential damage that's creating around climate change. Now, that has an indirect impact on pandemics because, of course, the type of extractivism that goes on creates an enormously greater risk of novel zoonotic infections and the next pandemic. So there is that connection, but also there are a number of measures that governments introduced that could be vulnerable to an investor-state dispute settlement. Only one so far has actually been registered, and that's a couple of European-based companies, the Santiago airport, and they want they're suing for lost profit because of the restrictions in air travel that the Chile imposed during the peak of the pandemic. But you have these corporate law firms, because they make a lot of money, kind of like in these ISDS disputes. They make a fortune. They're the second biggest profit makers after corporations and investors in these kind of ISDS system. So they're busy telling all of their clients to consider possible suits in the future. So talk about monopoly rights. Let's say, so TRIPS Plus, and this kind of monopoly right privilege that we've written into our trade rules. Now, like trade itself, it's not new. We had the enclosure, the privatization of the commons that occurred in much of Europe, and especially the ones we famously know about in England, in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. There's a wonderful little kind of ditty or poem in England that goes, the law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. So we've had these inequitable sort of rules even back then. Now, patents in health are fairly new, and patent medicines until the late 19th and through the early 20th century, patent medicines, that was quackery, right? That's the snake oil salespeople going around with a little patent this and patent that. I guess today it's now that Goop or whatever it's called website. So we had Bayer in 1899 was the kind of the first big major pharma to patent, and it patented aspirin. Couldn't do it in Europe because Europe said that's not a discovery. It could do it in the US and the UK. And of course, it wasn't a discovery. Willow bark is a traditional remedy. And the synthesis of a salicylic acid from willow bark was known 50 years earlier. So it's just an early example by which kind of like pharma begins to take what is already known, already discovered, already used, and then find a way of claiming ownership of it. Now, we really saw this increase massively in the post-war era with the 1950s and this whole explosion of new kind of in industrial sciences, the agrochem industry, and so on. And in this, I have to sort of say kind of a bit of an aside here about my Canadian kind of role in all of this. In 1867, Canada entered into a agreement with the U.S., the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. It was the precursor to NAFTA. And it is a time when Ronald Reagan was president. We had a kind of a very right-wing conservative prime minister, Brian Mulroney. Famously, the two of them actually sang a song about when Irish eyes are smiling during one of the summit meetings. So they really got along well. Now, in the U.S. was really quite concerned about wanting to take intellectual property rights and strengthen them. And they were concerned that a lot of the low and middle income countries were developing some technological expertise. And if they didn't do something to try to sort of control that whole area of scientific expertise, then pretty soon these countries would start to challenge and compete with the U.S. and its dominance. So Canada, we became the compliant guinea pig. We exchanged our 4% royalty system for compulsory licensing to give the U.S. and U.S. pharmaceutical companies an 8-year monopoly on their drugs, their new drugs entering into the country. But the U.S. was after more. And at the time, during the Uruguay round of negotiations that led to the birth of the World Trade Organization, the then CEO of Pfizer mobilized the CEOs of the computer companies, the agrochemical companies, and pressured like crazy the U.S. government to make sure that TRIPS would appear in the WTO system, and largely wrote the agreement rules on behalf of the U.S. Trade Committee, the Trade Negotiating Committee. So should we wonder why we have such a problem with Big Pharma now and with TRIPS? They wrote it for themselves, right? And governments basically agreed. So the U.S. eventually brought the European Union and Japan on side, and then with its Section 301, the kind of the bullying threats it makes to other countries that really want to get market access to the U.S., it basically made them a little bit more docile, so that when the final decision came, there was very little objection to having TRIPS inside the WTO system. And part of that is that developing countries really didn't understand the implications of that agreement. They also had other things that they were concerned about in terms of market access around agriculture and around special and differential treatment. Since TRIPS, we've seen the return on investment, AKA also known as profit, for the Big Pharma to shoot upwards. So it's now averages at least 30% a year. And that's twice what the industrial average kind of profit margins generally are. And an analysis a couple of years ago summarized the four aspects by which Big Pharma exerts such power. So the property power, or their intellectual property rights, vertical power, their lobbying, and let's not forget their donations. I mean, they donate hugely to the government parties that basically sustain them in their monopoly powers. Ideational power, kind of that if you touch intellectual property rights, hey, you're never going to have a good drug again. You're never going to have another vaccine, right? There's going to be no cures, so you better watch out. And material power, and that's the one that arose up during the pandemic, said, we have the technology. You poor countries, well, tough luck. You just don't have that ability. You don't have the technology. So this is the way in which that power is sustained. Then, of course, we know kind of about this hoarding issue. Now, by hoarding, I don't mean hanging on to vaccines needlessly. I refer to all the advanced purchase agreements that governments made. So we kind of accumulated and appropriated in advance all of these potentially successful vaccines. Now, Canada, for a while, we were the leader. We had advanced purchase agreements for enough vaccines for every Canadian 9.5 times, right? That's how much we had sort of put on order, enough vaccines to vaccinate everybody 9.5 times. Eventually, I'm happy to say Australia did take over first place, and they actually entered agreements for 10 times. So we had this huge excess kind of accumulation, this kind of sequestering of vaccine potential by high-income countries. And we know what the effects were, right? This massively unequal and unfair distribution. So early on, right, 80% of the vaccines in high-income countries and very little or no supplies in low and middle-income countries. And today, it's still pretty bad. And there's no reason to expect that we're going to see anything different with the rollout of new vaccines for the new variants in COVID that are going to keep cropping up. And already the European Union has notified that it's got an advanced purchase on the next vaccine, vaccines for the next pandemic, whatever which one that might be, 325 million. So we're still going to be able to do that. We're still going to be with that system. And so what does it translate to? So what you have here is the way in which public investment becomes private wealth. There's been a lot of talk about that in sessions already at this conference. Now, we know that at a minimum, the US and the EU spent at least $6 billion in developing these vaccines, the ones that were eventually proven successful. We're talking Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna. Some put the estimate actually much higher at around $20 billion. So that's direct funding for these vaccines. And it doesn't take into account that most of the base science around which these mRNA vaccines were created was previously publicly funded research. So it's really stuff that the public owns or should own, but we've created a system that allows the private companies to come and claim it for themselves. Now, all of this funding came without any requirements for kind of being shared openly, the innovations, the patents, the technology, or any agreements around affordable licensing for low and middle income countries. And that says nothing about the $93 billion in advanced market purchases that, as we all know, and the expression we use, de-risked any of the future work and costs that were absorbed by private pharma. Okay, just to say, monopoly capitalism pays really big time. So the pandemic created 40 new billionaires, and 25 of them were in big pharma alone. Now, Pfizer, because it's got some of the most easily accessible public records, its vaccine sales alone in over the 2 years of 2021, 2022, $72 billion. It admits that it has at least a 30% return on that investment. So that's the profit margin. And because of its use of tax haven nations, it has a tax rate, an effective tax rate of just less than 6%. The translation, that becomes $20 billion over the 2-year period, take-home profit. Of course, all of which goes back to investors, most of whom are the financialized private equity firms that we've heard a lot about in the last couple of days. Interesting or important to note, many of the world's countries, finally about 130 of them or more, agreed that we need to impose a minimum 15% corporate tax rate across every single country. Well, Pfizer, Moderna, and the other big pharma adamantly opposed. And again, what they say, if you do that, you're not going to have any cures. You're not going to have any medicines. You're not going to have any vaccines for the next pandemic. No, threat, threat, threat. Then we have the failure of the TRIPS waiver. And I don't think there's any other way to describe it but a failure. So we went from a comprehensive temporary suspension of a number of different rules within the TRIPS agreement for vaccines, medical products, exactly, to having one exception only, one relaxation only, and that was around the export of compulsory licenses, and only for one product, only for vaccines. So we went from an attempt to basically begin to reshape this whole intellectual property rights pharmaceutical architecture to having one tiny little measure. That's it. Now, low and middle income countries with manufacturing ability inside this TRIPS waiver that was finally agreed upon, there's actually a little line at the bottom on that one page that basically says, low and middle income countries that have the manufacturing capacity they're encouraged to make a binding commitment not to do so. So they're actually encouraged by the waiver not to use it, right? So it's stated right in the waiver. You kind of think, wow. So I describe that as the epic battle of the 99% versus the 1%. And guess what, guys? We lost. Now, Canada, kind of, again, bringing it back to home for me, I call it hypocrisy. That's a bit of a strong term to use. But if you consider that in Canada, early on in the pandemic, we actually rewrote some of our own pharmaceutical laws that would essentially allow us to introduce compulsory licensing for any product that we needed to deal with the pandemic, especially vaccines, without having to consult the patent holder and for a 4% royalty. So we went back to our old system and we wrote the law and said we would do that. And then it silently disappeared, that law. It did not renew it at Parliament, and it just disappeared in October of 2020. And that was the time when it began to exercise or finalize all of its advanced purchase contracts with the pharmaceutical vaccine manufacturers. Now, throughout all of this, and this on a personal level, I spent hundreds of hours where I was writing, petitioning, meeting, I testified, blogged, et cetera, to try to push Canada into some sort of a position of support. And Canada's line was always, we neither oppose nor support the waiver. They kept sort of saying, we need to see the evidence that the TRIPS agreement is not working, right? Where is the evidence? Well, when the sponsors of the TRIPS waiver kept coming up with the evidence at all the WTO committee meetings, Canada's response continued to be, we need to see the evidence of why the TRIPS agreement is not working. It's using that same line now around discussions to try to extend that waiver to beyond vaccines to other medical products. So it says, we're always working to find a solution that works for everyone, to which I go, yeah, right? It's, oh, anyway. Now, to maintain an ethical global veneer, Canada also, we gave over $800 million to COVAX, although some of that money we used to actually buy from COVAX or to bring back AstraZeneca before other people got it, before any country in Africa got it. And we also kept arguing that the reason why TRIPS was good enough. Voluntary licensing is good enough. Vaccine companies pledge not to profit during the pandemic, and it's like wrong, wrong, and wrong. Now, there's another way of explaining this or looking at this as well. Article 31 bis, right, the one about the parallel importing. After this was agreed upon, Canada was the first country to very proudly announce that it had amended its legislation to make use of Article 31 bis, something called the Canadian Access to Medicines regime. Now, this was so complex in order to be compliant with Article 31 bis that the one attempt to use it, which was a generic company in Canada and Rwanda for a triple combination ARV. It took over 2 years from the start of that to be able to actually finalize and have a small shipment to go off to Rwanda. And the generic company in Canada and Rwanda said, never again, because it did not work. Now, then we have the pandemic. We have a small company in Canada that got approached and entered into an agreement with Bolivia to basically supply through a compulsory license to supply the J&J, Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Johnson & Johnson was not interested in a voluntary license. So this company in Canada sought to get a compulsory license. However, it could not do so because in order for that to qualify for a compulsory license, Canada had to move that vaccine into its Schedule I category. It never did. It never did. Bolivia says it was a lack of a political will. Others think that it was really just a bit of an outcome of pharmaceutical bullying, because at the time, Canada was trying to sort of maintain its own kind of supply of contracts. There were not necessarily any guarantee that it was going to get the vaccine. So it was a bit terrified. And the pharmaceutical companies were sort of saying, look, you support the waiver or do something like that? Oh, you may not get your vaccines. So those threats were used. Now, what this has meant now is that we're shifting venues. And we're shifting venues to look at the pandemic treaty, or what the WHO calls CA+. We look at the revised international health regulations. There's an attempt to sort of like build a hub and spoke kind of vaccine manufacturing or generic pharmaceutical manufacturing in low and middle income countries. This issue of trying to push for funding now for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. So the World Bank has now announced that it says we need to have about $10 billion a year to go to low and middle income countries for their pandemic preparedness and response. Some of that might go to their capacity to have their own pharmaceutical manufacturing control, but a lot of it is really about sort of being able to comply with international health regulations or those sorts of reporting systems to make sure that whatever nasty stuff happens there doesn't come back into high-income countries. And then this idea that we really need to look at alternative political economy models that would begin to subordinate capitalist markets to public health goals. Now, I think I've got more to say, but I think I'm going to end it on that for now. And during the questions, because I want to talk a little bit more about what the state of the negotiations are that are taking place around the pandemic treaty and around some of these vaccine manufacturing. So, but for now, I'll pass it back over to the chair.